This is the Drawing Dragon, and today I will not be drawing. I wanted to do something a little bit different and instead show you another one of my hobbies. What I have here is a set of polymer clay figures I made myself over the last few years. This set is specifically characters from Undertale and a few from Deltarune. This is only about half of my clay projects. I'll show you the other half in a second video if you guys are interested. This is a light-up display case by Studio Decor. There's a string of LED lights around the base. Mine seem to be dying right now, but I'll worry about that some other time. I never actually use the lights anyway, so it's kind of weird that they're dying. As you can probably tell, a lot of the figures have fallen over, which is what I'm going to be fixing today, and I'll show you these guys up close along the way. Now I want to clarify, these 5 in the front are not polymer figures. I did not make them. These are the official Undertale figurines from Fangamer. I just include them in the display because I have nowhere else to put them, and they set the Undertale theme of the rest of the display. The point of this display case was not to be a permanent display. I wanted to be able to take the figures out without damaging them in case I wanted to make room for more. So I used a few different non-permanent adhesives that clearly weren't able to hold these guys in place very well. This is some sort of craft tape that seems to have stuck to the display case, but not to the base of the figurines. I tried to remove it at first, but it just wasn't budging, and I decided that was a problem for future me to solve. So the reason this video exists is that I found this non-permanent craft glue at Michael's and thought it might work. It comes out like glue, but apparently dries like a non-permanent glue dot. Fingers crossed it works. I'm going to go ahead and take out the figures that have fallen over or are loose, and I'll show them to you more closely before gluing them back in. The few figures that are still stuck really solid, I'm just going to leave them in the display case for now. I'll go ahead and show off the figures still in the display while we're looking at them. So this Nightmare Fuel Papyrus is actually one of the first clay pieces I ever made, hence why it looks so lumpy and still kinda shoddy. I made him using multiple colors of clay, since it would be quite a while before I figured out using white clay and painting it works much better for me. He was actually crazy hard to make since he's enormous and I was a beginner who wasn't smart enough to start smaller. I honestly still haven't learned. Despite how awkward this skull looks, it wasn't a bad sculpt attempt and I'm still proud of it. I have no idea how I got these folds in the scarf since colored clay is so stiff and temperamental. From behind, he looks considerably worse. You can see the breakage along the arm. I have re-glued the arms back on more times than I can remember. You can see my legendary planning skills at work as the cape fits seamlessly onto the back. I baked it as a separate piece, so of course there was no curvature to match the back, and I ended up just smacking it on like an awful backpack. I actually still kind of like the spine and pelvis details, even though they're pretty shoddy. Here you can see another reason I don't like using colored clay, this kind of tie-dye ripple effect. It'd be cool for other projects, but not for Papyrus's pants. Now let's move on to Asriel since he's staring into my soul. Since he's behind these other two characters, this is as close as I can get, but I honestly don't want to get closer because he scares me. Despite his demon Muppet face, I'm actually not mad at the details, like his little heart necklace and little claws, and his awful, awful toes. Considering how easily white clay picks up dirt, I can't get over how smooth these ears and hair are. It's just hard to appreciate next to those buggy eyes. Like Papyrus, I used different colored clay instead of paint, so the stripes on his shirt pop out and don't look like one singular shirt. I actually love this fluffy goat tail, and for some reason I never made it again on my future Asriel attempts. From the back we can see that cute fluffy tail again, and we can see just how bad these stripes look as separate pieces instead of being painted on one piece. So yeah, that's Sleep Paralysis Demon Asriel. I hope we don't have to look at him ever again. Speaking of Asriel, this was a later attempt, when I had gotten a little more comfortable using clay. Don't worry about Alphys and Gaster, we'll come back to them in a second. So here we have another Asriel, this one holding a cute little flower. You can see I actually painted the yellow onto the green shirt instead of using separate pieces, and it did not work any better. And somehow this guy is even more terrifying than the other one in some ways. His hair doesn't look as good. His eyes are also still terrifying, this time in the opposite direction because they're so small. So even though it's a little bit better from a technical standpoint, it's still downright terrifying. And I don't know why Asriel is the character giving me this much trouble. Now going back to Alphys, this character was actually a much later project, as you can probably tell from the sudden spike in quality. She came about 1.5 years later, and even though she looks absolutely nothing like Alphys for some reason, she's still one of my favorite pieces I've ever made. I just think she's really cute. I love these little clasped hands and little folded feet. Here you can see her weird jutting out little teeth that don't really make sense, and her sharp little nose. These glasses actually are pieces of plastic that I cut. That's why they look horrible, that is as round as I could get them. And then once again we have these cute little fingers with their little painted claws. As you can see from above, I translated her head spikes as kind of pointing one after the other down the back of her neck instead of in a frill around her head like a triceratops like most people draw. And again, those little feet. I'm sorry, I love them. Here from the side you can see more clearly what I meant about the spikes. Instead of like a frill or 3 jutting out from the sides of her head, I saw it as 3 going down the back of her neck, and then I added these little pieces on the side because it didn't look right. For this piece I actually experimented with textures a little more, which I hadn't done before. You can see it really clearly here on the tail, but I'll show you more closely in a second. Here in the back you can see the spikes on both sides, so it kind of looks like hair, but I wanted it to look more like the bristles on a lizard or spikes on a dinosaur. Here, especially on this side of the tail, you can see kind of the texturing I was talking about. I took a little metal brush pick type tool that came with my clay set that I hadn't used before, and kind of poking it at certain points gives her kind of a scaly look. It isn't that clear in the video, but in real life she kind of looks something like an alligator. So that's our Alphys, who looks absolutely nothing like Alphys, but I still am really proud of. Here's another one of my favorite pieces I've made. It's Mad Dummy. As you can see, she's kind of falling over. But what's interesting is this is because I just made her really badly. The rod inside actually started to shift while I was baking her, so she's actually standing up as straight as she can. I really like this one because I actually glued in some real cotton after she was finished baking to give the illusion of a stuffed animal breaking open. From the back you can see even more clearly just how crooked this thing is. I'm going to attempt to fix it once again, even though I've tried several times, but hopefully this time I can figure out something that works. Here's a closer look at Dummy. I really like the details on this one. The seam going down the back of the head, it came out really nice. And like I mentioned before, the cotton jutting out from the middle, it looks better than I could have expected. Like Alphys, I actually tried to texture the clay with this piece, and I did so by taking a crumpled up napkin and pressing it into the clay piece before baking it. Here's another look at some of the seams and sutures. The effect just looks really nice. Here in the back you can kind of see more clearly the jagged edges of the clay, so the cotton looks like it's actually coming out of the figure instead of just being glued on top. So let's see if we can't get Dummy standing up a little bit more straight. What I did was I basically just took some crazy glue and applied it to the base. Hopefully when the glue dries, it won't be elastic enough to let her snap back into her leaning position, and she'll be just a little bit more straight. Since I didn't want to sit there and hold her forever, I just propped her up against the glue bottle. Hopefully when I finally remove the bottle later, she won't just fall over again like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Greetings from the future. Later when I took the bottle away, Mad Dummy did in fact stand up straighter. I am so proud. Going back in time again, let's take a look at little Dr. Gaster. This little blob man was actually the first thing I ever made with polymer clay. For Christmas, I got a set of assorted colors of polymer clay. I'd never used it before, and I thought this little blob man would probably be a very easy first attempt at making something. And yeah, he was. He's still extremely wonky. You can see all the little pock marks of me not knowing how to hold the clay and not knowing how to not get it dirty, and me crudely trying to put black paint into the eye holes, but since he's a little melty void man, it kinda just adds to the aesthetic. Speaking of Gaster, here we have a random Gaster blaster that is in serious need of an orthodontist. You would think this wonky looking little guy was another one of my early attempts, but no, actually he came several years later. I guess I was just having a really bad day. On the underside of the jaw, you can see two little indents where the lower half of the jaw was supposed to connect, and once again you can witness my brilliant and impeccable planning skills. There is no mistake here. I actually am pretty fond of this mostly accidental optical illusion. Because the main part of the eye is so deep and the white parts of the eye are so deep in the socket, turning him around kind of makes it look like the eyes are following you, and I did not do it on purpose because, as we've established, I'm an excellent planner. Back to the early days of using multiple colors of clay instead of painting white, we have this actually admittedly pretty good Flowey I made. Like, I worked really hard on the detail of the vines and the leaves and the petals, and they hold up. They don't look bad at all. He doesn't look anything like Flowey, really, but, you know, just as a little smiling flower creature, it's pretty darn adorable. The separate colors also seem to actually make sense here. But since this guy came out so top-heavy, and he really doesn't look anything like Flowey, I did in fact try to make another Flowey a year or two down the line. And here we have other Flowey, who looks much more accurate to his in-game counterpart. The details are much less defined, he's much smaller, though I still did give him some texturing on the clay pot and the dirt. And this is actually one single piece of clay that I painted. You can see on the bottom where the paint started to peel a little. So, because this was a later piece, I had actually figured out that making this whole thing out of just white clay, baking it, and then painting it is much easier, and honestly, in most cases it looks better, in my opinion. So now, comparing two different Floweys with two different techniques, neither of them look bad. I actually am really proud of both of them. One of them is definitely more the scale I wanted. He definitely looks much more like the video game character he's based on. But the other is not bad at all, especially considering how early an attempt it was. And here we have our demon child, Chara. As you can see, she is holding a little knife that snapped in half. Lucky for everyone, I guess, but I'm going to glue that back on in a minute, don't worry. I've never actually put a varnish or anything on any of my painted clay pieces. Most of the time they look just fine, but for some reason the paints I used here came out really, really muted. They're the right color, there's just no shine to them at all, so maybe someday I'll put some sort of varnish on her. So I tried to make Chara match the official Frisk figurine's proportions as accurately as possible. As you can see, I definitely succeeded. There is no difference whatsoever between these two figures. They are the same in every way. I joke, but it's not bad. I actually made this adorable little display stand for Chara, since the Fangamer figures have their own little stands. I even poked little holes in her feet using the base itself as a model before I baked her, and she still doesn't fit at all. So I didn't end up using it, but I think it's pretty enough to just kind of sit here as its own piece of art. And maybe when I finally make a non-terrifying Asriel, I will put him here instead. Now I'm just going to take a moment to bring our friend Crazy Glue back and hopefully repair Chara's broken knife. There we go, and as you can probably tell from the very clear break down the middle, I've had to repair this thing multiple times. Now let's move on to another one of my favorite figures that I've made, and it's King Asgore, who is also one of my favorite characters in Undertale, so that's kind of fitting. You can see, even after multiple coats of paint, there's still a lot of patchiness here in the cape. So this is another character that I might varnish or something just to make it look like a more cohesive piece. I used metallic paints to give a nice shine to his armor, both the gold and the silver, and I also have a glossy white that I like to use on the eyes. I don't know why I always consider him to be like a redhead, like having orange hair instead of blonde, but I do. And I am really proud of the hair texturing on this piece. I rolled the clay very thin, cut it into very small strands, and then ran my knife over those strands to give it the illusion of hair. Now, something interesting about this piece, even though this guy's one of the largest pieces I've made, he's actually completely hollow. You can see when I flip him upside down and the illusion is ruined, he's really just one big cylinder-shaped piece. In order to use less clay for larger pieces, you can actually crunch up pretty much any kind of paper, tissue paper, wax paper, shape it into the form you want, and then cover it in clay. That way baking time is much faster and you're wasting much less clay. Like Chara, this is another figure that I actually based its proportions on the official Fangamer figures, this time using Toriel. Even though Asgore's a little bit bigger, I tried to match the shape and size of the feet, the thickness and length of the ears, and even the shape of the snout to Toriel's, even though I think I kind of failed on 2 out of 3 of those. Very random side note, the official Toriel Fangamer figure is probably my favorite. Everything about her is just smooth and cute and perfect. I love her. Speaking of the Dreamer Royal family, here we go, Asriel attempt number 3, this time in his God of Hyperdeath form. This is another one of my favorite pieces, and it took a surprisingly long time to paint. Along the rim of his cape, we have rainbow colors symbolizing the 7 human souls, And on the underside of his cape, I used iridescent white paint to paint tiny little monster souls too, and even though this part is usually hidden from view because it's underneath him, the effect is really cool. On the back of his cape, there's just a scatter of rainbow colors to resemble a galaxy. You can see here the cape actually snapped in this place after baking, so I had to glue it back on. That's what that kind of shine right there is. I can't get rid of it. These two power orbs or whatever he's holding are just marbles. You can actually bake glass in the oven with clay. Anything that basically won't catch fire, you can bake with clay. I used iridescent paint on his horns and shoulder pauldrons to give them a nice shine. One thing I wish I hadn't done was make his eyes so dark, or the stripes under his eyes so dark, because the dark on top of dark makes it really hard to see his actual eyes, but I'm not really sure what I could have done to make it look better. I actually glued his horns on the wrong way. They were supposed to be pointing backwards. I'm banished from the Undertale fandom. I got Asriel's horns the wrong way. I attempted to shape his feet like he was standing on his tiptoes, so when you actually stand him up, he appears to be levitating instead of just standing there like a dork. You can't really tell, but it's cool. Just like with Asgore, I used the official Toriel figure as kind of a model for Asriel's proportions, and still got them extremely wrong. Moving on to another one of my favorites. I know I keep saying that. I'm really proud of all of these in their own way, so a lot of them are my favorite. But this one was one of my favorites. Here we have little monster kid, who once again looks really nothing like his character in game, but is such a cute, shiny, smooth little piece. I'm really satisfied with how he turned out. He somehow looks more like the real monster kid from the back than the front. Once again, you can see where the glue I previously used basically stripped the paint right off his feet when I pulled him off the display stand. And here we have one of the only Deltarune characters I've made, Lancer, who is actually my favorite character from that game. For some reason, the black paint came out very matte, and the blue paint came out very shiny, but I actually kind of like the contrast. I'm not sure why I decided to make him sitting, leaning backwards, but it's a really cute pose. Now, Mettaton EX is one of the most complicated and large pieces I've ever made, and I'm actually not really happy with him at all, unfortunately. A lot of his robot parts with the metallic paint do look pretty cool, but his face is so awful and the pose is so weird, I can't really appreciate what I've done. I probably am going to redo this one someday. Moving over here to get a better look, you can see this guy is absolutely gargantuan. I actually didn't bake him as one piece because I really couldn't. I baked him in separate pieces. a torso one piece, each arm a piece, each leg a piece, the head its own piece, and then after baking I glued them all together. And his legs are still kind of loose. The back section with the off and on switch actually looks really cool. He looks way better from the back than the front. And yet more stripped paint. Moving in a little closer to see the details, the arms actually aren't bad. They're a little bumpy, a little wonky, but all in all, they're actually pretty good. I am actually kind of fond of the texturing on his hair, not the hairstyle itself. I think that turned out really bad, but the details of the hair and the very dark, shiny black paint actually look pretty cool, and the pink highlight came out really nice. I just want to focus on this hand for a second because I really like this hand, and it's one of the only things about this piece that I thought turned out perfect. Speaking of hands, I actually gave him 2 right hands, so his thumb is on the wrong side of his hand on his other arm, and I did not notice until I'd finished painting. This middle segment of the body is actually hollow. I put a little pink heart in there, just like Mettaton's real heart. Then I covered it with a tiny piece of see-through plastic, just like Alphys' glasses, but for some reason it clouded up and you can't really see the inside at all. After talking about Mettaton EX, and after talking about how he's one of the most complex pieces I've ever made, it just seems fitting to move on to the most complex piece I've ever made without question, who happens to be a character inspired by Mettaton. So here we have Spamton Neo, who is in fact a semi-working puppet, and you can see just by looking at him how much effort went into this thing. This was easily the longest piece to make, taking me several weeks. You can see his hair is similar to Mettaton's, with the same technique and the same glossy black paint, but I had definitely perfected it at this point, and it looks much better. Each of his limbs are separate clay pieces attached by yarn so he can move them freely. His main body is made out of clay, but I actually decorated it using different materials like foam and cardboard and nylon to give him kind of that weird mishmash, almost papery look he has. Looking at his wings, you can see only the top part is made of clay, while the wings themselves are actually pieces of colorful cardstock paper or something like that. Kind of similar to Alphys' glasses, I wanted to use plastic to make his eyes instead of clay, to kind of give them a see-through shine. These are actually 2 tiny little buttons I found. That's kind of why they're shaped so strangely. Getting a closer look at the hair, it took a really long time because unlike Mettaton's, I actually made it strand by strand, but it was worth it. It looks so much better. As you can see, there are actually holes in the clay body for the yarn to go through, so tugging on one arm actually makes the other arm move. The puppet strings are actually these weird green nylon tubes we had just kind of sitting around in a craft box. My family's that weird family that just has a box of unused craft stuff. Anyway, I saw these nylon tube things, and cutting them in half gave this kind of translucent green color that was just perfect for Spamton string. Also, in the same craft box, we just happened to have this real puppet holder thing from a puppet I had when I was very little. Why we kept it, I have no idea, but I'm really glad we did, because me seeing it in the craft box is the only reason I got the idea to make Spamton Neo in the first place. As you can see, he's not a very high quality puppet. He mostly just kind of flops around in a strange sort of way, but you know, that's kind of what Spamton does, so I think he turned out really, really good. Now it's time to hopefully remember the order I had these guys set up in and glue them back into their places. Hopefully this time there won't be as much falling over. Old Flowey was being extremely rude and not staying put for some reason. So it turns out this glue actually had to sit overnight, so I had to wait until morning to see if it even worked, but lucky for me, I came up the next morning and found out yes, all of my characters were standing nice and solid and strong, but they still seemed loose enough that I could hopefully move them in the future. And there we have our completed Undertale Polymer clay figure display case. Thank you so much for checking out this video and letting me share some of my creations with you. If you really enjoyed it, please let me know because like I mentioned, I have an entire other display box full of these guys that I would also love to share with you. The figures in that box aren't quite as thematically consistent as the Undertale box, although quite a few of them are from a single video game, and that game happens to be another one that I'm really fond of. And before you get excited, no, it's not Stanley Parable. I wasn't into that yet. It's not a box of Stanleys. I'm sorry. Anyway, this was a fun project to try, it was a fun video to make, and I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it.